かがですか渡辺なんです 20th Century Fox is no more. The old studio has now been fully consumed by the Disney empire. And yes, there are still the vestiges of the TV network as well as the news operation. But as far as the development infrastructure, as far as the actual studio operations, it is now part of Team Disney. And this is sad, because even though Fox had been through numerous owners and numerous CEOs over time, it had been one of those studios that still maintained that entrepreneurial spirit that was there when it was founded. And that entrepreneurial spirit was there whether the leader was Darryl F. Zanuck or Rupert Murdoch, because these were all people who were willing to take risks in form, in content, in subject matter, in putting it all on the line and taking what came without really crying about it or looking for pity. No, Darryl F. Zanuck really summed up what Fox was about when he took a look at Cleopatra and complained that the big problem with this movie, which he knew was going to come close to ruining the studio to even the point where he couldn't bring it back, said, the problem with this fucking movie is that the guy is weak. And you know what? He was totally right. That Richard Burton as Mark Anthony was not someone who could compel interest. He was someone who was a loser. And that's the one thing that Fox could never tolerate as a studio, and that was to be a story about losers. The movie that I want to look at that exemplifies kind of what 20th Century Fox meant in their average garden variety picture is Peyton Place. Now, Peyton Place was based on a notorious novel by Grace Metalius, and it was one of those books that was a huge sensation, a sensation so large that today we find it incomprehensible that such a common, simple story could have caused such an uproar. But you have to remember, in the 1950s, we were living in a far more conformist era that our models of what a small town was like was seen in Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver or The Andy Griffith Show. And to write a novel about the sexual secrets of a small town as opposed to the wicked city was quite unexpected. And what was even more unexpected was that Fox was able to take that novel, as tacky as it was, as sensationalistic as it was, as wonderful as it is to reread today, and turn it into a movie that was actually better than the book. And how was it better than the book? Well, it took the raw material of the novel, which was very pulpy, and found the human core in it, and took that human core, replaced the sensationalistic sexuality with it, and came up with something that fit in very nicely with the undercurrents of what was going on in the 1950s. It also played off the images of a lot of its stars. The main lead was played by Lana Turner, who at this time was just getting over a very sensationalistic murder trial where her daughter had murdered her lover, Johnny Stompamato. At this point in her career, Turner was better known for her antics in her private life than she was for her public life. In fact, some WAG critics used to exclaim, wow, if she could save some of that dramatic intensity she uses off-screen, on-screen, she would be a really great actress. Peyton Place proved to be something that was able to capitalize on that. And yes, on the one hand, you can say, wow, isn't that tacky that the studio would ask a star to take the raw material of her life, especially a tragedy like the murder of her lover and the fact that her daughter was clearly into the same guy, and bring that element into the movie about a mother who is struggling with her daughter. But that was the point. The point was that it was brave of her to do it because she knew she would be vilified for it. She knew that publicity would in turn generate box office return. And sure enough, it did. And Turner, in spite of the fact that her performance in it is icy and rather aloof, like all of her performances are, is able to convey that is the essence of the character she's playing. Peyton Place is one of those movies that follows the lives of many different characters over a large number of years, and each of those characters intersects with each other's life. Now, this type of movie making is always rather challenging because the interest that you have for any one character at a given moment can be divided. And that division of interest might make the movie overall dull, especially if one of the characters is not especially liked. Fortunately, the director, Mark Robeson, who 10 years later would make that immortal classic Valley of the Dolls, at this time understood what it took to bring out the sensitivity in the material, to not be afraid of where the story was going and take it there. So there are moments in Peyton Place that are melodramatically cringy and at times very, very off-putting almost because it's so overwrought. But given the amount of action that it has in it, given the fact that it is fighting against the Father Knows Best iconography, this is not only expected, it is something to be celebrated. And certainly the fact that the studio was willing to take on the scandalous material to begin with and try to find how to make it work was something that could only happen under someone like Zanuck. Although, truthfully, Harry Cohen was doing the same thing over at Columbia with From Here to Eternity, and perhaps From Here to Eternity was in a way an inspiration that you could take a book that was known for its sex, and knowing that you're also in the production code, use something else to take the place of it that would still make the narrative strong. One of the things that really makes Peyton Place work is the performance of Diane Varsi, who plays Turner's daughter, Allison. Now, Allison is, of course, an analog for Grace Metalius herself. She's someone who wants to be a writer. She's someone who perhaps feels too deeply for the town. She's someone who desperately longs to escape and to find her own happiness independent. She knows that her mother went to the big city and had come back after her husband had died. And of course, this is the first of the secrets that Peyton Place reveals, and that is that it turns out that her mother had been a mistress and that she'd never married the father, and that she had come back and given birth to an illegitimate daughter. And today, that's not a surprise. In 1950s, this was a pretty sensational thing, especially since the story itself is taking place at the beginning of World War II. So there's a lot of uncomfortableness around that. Allison is currently in high school, and through her experience in high school, we get to meet a lot of the other characters whom we will see grow up and face many different challenges. One of those characters is Norman. And Norman, today, we read as being totally gay. He's played by Russ Tamblyn. And Tamblyn, I must hand it to him, is willing to play that for all it's worth. He's willing to admit that he's a sissy. He's willing to admit that he's completely dominated by his mother. He's willing to admit that he's even ashamed to ask Allison out for a date.
Everybody in this town hides behind plain wrappers. You're so afraid. You've even been afraid to ask me to the graduation dance.
Oh, Allison, I want... Well, see, I'm just not asking anybody. I'll be there, but I can't ask you.
Why not?
Well, my mother.
Your mother.
Well, she wouldn't actually forbid it. It's just that she gets jealous of anybody at all that I spend my time with. Oh, you don't know her. You don't have to live with her. But she's my mother. There's nothing I can do about that.
We see that Norman is able to respond to the need for affection from someone else.
I'll prove everything your mother ever said was wrong. Would you kiss me, Norman?
I don't think I can.
Yes, you could. Kiss me. I don't know why I should act so experienced. It was only my second kiss this year.
And this tenderness that comes across in him, maybe goes against the fact that he's being played as more or less gay. And it will again be further undermined later on when we see him coming back as a soldier, someone who has gotten his masculinity card handed back to him.
Hey, you look older, more grown up.
Well, the uniform helps.
And all the decorations.
Yeah? Hey, what have you been doing?
Living in New York.
Have you been doing any writing? I remember you always liked to write.
Yeah, I did some writing.
One of the other people that's an Allison classmate is Selena. Now, Selena is where this movie has its biggest challenge, because Selena is the victim character. Selena is someone for whom the world has sat on her like a duck on a June bug. She lives in a tar paper shack with her mother, who happens to be Allison's maid, and her alcoholic father. Her brother, who is probably her only protector, ends up running off. And so Selena is always faced in an abusive environment, and no less abusive than when her father, who went off to the army, comes back from the war, sees Selena and rapes her. She becomes pregnant, and the doctor is faced with a huge challenge. Now, his challenge is made easier by the film censors at the time, who would not allow a doctor to give someone an abortion and then continue to have his license, so she has a convenient fall down a hill. But it's still clear that this will be a secret, and that medical records will be doctored in order to keep Selena's shame a secret. Of course, this is going to be something that's going to come back and haunt everyone. The character who introduces us to this town is Mike Rossi. He's an outsider who's come to take over the role of principal in the school, and he's the outsider who serves as the guide into this town and into the scandals that you will find in the town. And he, of course, is going to be someone who has a relationship with Constance, with Lana Turner, and help her get over her guilt, help her get over her sense of having done wrong and having to come back to the town with her tail between her legs, so to speak. And we see that he's an exemplar of what will be coming in the 60s in terms of professors who understand the troubles of youth. He wants the students to learn how to think for themselves.
I have just two rules.
Oh?
First, I want this school to teach the truth, as far as we know it. I don't want any teacher making a fairy tale out of life. It's hard enough as it is without being unequipped to meet it.
That's a good rule. Shall we sit down?
And rule two, teach a minimum of facts and a maximum of ideas. Our main job is to teach children how to think, not just to memorize for a couple of weeks.
And because of that, the woman who was denied the job of principal because perhaps she was too old, Miss Elsie, likes him, and she's willing to work with him, and we see that she can respect him. That's what's different about this Peyton Place. That even though there are challenges to the characters and there's melodramatic moments, we see each one of them facing that challenge. Now, Allison is going to face the biggest challenge of them all. She's going to find out the bitter truth about her status as an illegitimate child at the moment when she's being accused of having had illicit relations with Norman, because the town busybody happened to catch Betty Anderson and Rodney fooling around in flagrante delicto.
If you keep this up someday, I will do what you keep accusing me of.
I wouldn't doubt it. You're just like your father about sex. In that way, you're just like him.
Don't you say things about my father. He was a wonderful man.
Wonderful.
And fine and good to you, and that's what you told me, so don't blame him for anything.
Wonderful and fine and good. That's what I told you? Well, I lied. I lied about him because I was ashamed of him and of myself.
Well, then why did you marry him?
I didn't. And he didn't marry me because he already had a wife.
Not only does she discover that she's illegitimate, but she goes upstairs and finds Selena's mother hanging in her bedroom because the mother has found out what had happened to Selena and couldn't take it anymore. Here's where the movie is brave in a way we don't expect. That Allison, when she starts recovering, instead of using this opportunity to use truth and get along better with her mother, says,
As soon as I can, I'm going to get dressed, pack my things and leave Peyton Place. I never want to see this town or you again.
You can't mean it.
I mean it. I'm going to New York.
Oh, please, Allison. I was only trying to protect you.
I was an accident that you hated and tried to hide.
But I loved you from the moment you were born. Try to believe me. Well, how will you live? What will you do for money?
I have enough to get there. I'll find a job.
Suppose you can't find a job.
Then I'll live off some men the way you did.
This was unprecedented at that era. Even if you look at something like Rebel Without a Cause, they didn't quite go there, where you can see that bitterness against the parent and that willingness to be that vicious. Now, of course, Selena's father, played by Arthur Kennedy, his body is found, and it becomes clear that he was murdered, and there's a court trial. The court trial is probably the weakest part of the movie. It's typical courtroom melodrama. And you got Lauren Green playing the prosecutor, and it's just... But we have the doctor confessing what happened, and because of that, we have Selena being declared innocent. But this isn't before a lot of the town's hypocrisy is brought up. Selena, at first, does not want the truth to come out because her boyfriend is a good boy, and she doesn't want him to have to face the ridicule that she feels the town will put against her for something that wasn't her fault. This is a stark reminder for those of us today of just how different the world is now than it was then. And it's almost shocking to see that. And at the end, we see that the boyfriend doesn't leave her, that he is going to stick by her, and that he's disappointed that she would even think that he would think that way. So the movie's also giving another very subtle message here, and that is that sometimes people are much better than we think they can be. And that's one of the inspirational things about this. Now, we get to our happy ending when we see of Allison and her mother reunited and Norman being invited into the house. And so we guess that everyone's going to live happily ever after. But we do know that the secrets of Peyton Place will remain. Where this exemplifies what 20th Century Fox was willing to do is look at how many issues it confronts in the space of a quasi drama, a commercial drama. We're dealing with infidelity. We're dealing with illegitimate children. We're dealing with children who are oppressed by their parents. We're dealing with class warfare. We're dealing with parental expectations that are stifling their children. We're dealing with young sexuality. The murder stuff is flashy, but what really gets us is this sense of entrapment by society's rules. This is what Darryl Zanuck, the president of Fox at this time, was so strong on. Remember that Darryl Zanuck, in the 1940s, was the first person to do a commercial for the mainstream Caucasian audience, an African-American movie, Stormy Weather, which presented contemporary African Americans, not Cabin in the Cotton, not Gone with the Wind Mammy, but real performers that you were supposed to appreciate, and not in a black-only movie. And this was right during the war. And in the 1950s, he would do Carmen Jones, which would cover the same thing. We had the whole concept of miscegenation being covered in Pinky. And perhaps the most daring thing that Zanuck did was he made Gentleman's Agreement in 1947. It's a movie that doesn't necessarily play well today. But think about what it's about. It's about anti-Semitism. This is 2 years out from World War II, 2 years out from the liberation of the concentration camps. And he's willing to say, look at what's going on in your country. You are having Jews who had been so persecuted in Europe now being persecuted in the United States. This is unacceptable. What was interesting about Zanuck doing this? You know what? He was the only studio head who wasn't Jewish. Okay, Walt Disney too. But in terms of the mainstream dramas, it was only Zanuck, and only he had the courage to do the Stormy Weathers, to do the the Gentlemen's Agreements, to do the Peyton Places, to really push the edge of that envelope. And you've got to appreciate someone who had that kind of maverick understanding of what an audience would do. Fox, more than any other studio, was not about people giving in to their oppression, but they would fight it. Look at The Grapes of Wrath. What happens in The Grapes of Wrath? We have the Jodes go through horrible crises, and at the end, Ma Jode, in a speech that may be a little risible today, talks about being we the people, we will survive. And that's what Zanuck believed, because he himself was a survivor, and he helped the studio. Even after their $40 million calamity of Cleopatra, he was able to revitalize it. And then when The Sound of Music hit, he was willing to take other risks, which unfortunately almost took the studio out. But then in 1970, the studio would make Patton and MASH the same year. This is not the kind of filmmaking that anyone in Hollywood does today. And because of it, we are the poorer for it. And so we got to say goodbye to 20th Century Fox, but hopefully there'll be a resurrection of sorts with another Darryl F. Zanuck type.